Daniel Farrow was the reason the grant existed, and the reason his name wasn't on the guest list, and it took a compliance crisis to make Halcroft Regional Health Network understand the difference. The night Halcroft unveiled its federal imaging grant, $94 million, the largest public health infrastructure investment Alberta had seen in 2 decades. He was lying on his back in sub-basement B of the main tower, arms inside the access panel of a 3 Tesla MRI unit, listening for a vibration that every automated diagnostic in the building insisted did not exist. He'd noticed it 4 days earlier. Not with equipment, with the part of his brain that had spent 19 years learning how each machine in the building behaved under load, the way a person learns the sound of their own house settling at night. The gradient coil shim was fatiguing, not critically, not yet, but in a pattern that would start introducing field inhomogeneity into long scan acquisitions within 3 to 5 weeks. By the time the artifact showed up clearly enough for a radiologist to flag formally, several thousand scans would already have passed through that machine, carrying a subtle distortion in the tissue boundary rendering. He replaced the shim, ran a full calibration sequence, and logged the correction at 11:47 that evening. He noted that the underlying cause, a microfracture pattern in the mounting bracket consistent with the unit running above recommended duty cycles, required a duty cycle review he had now requested 3 times in writing. He left a copy in Sandra Yee's mailbox, another in the departmental queue, locked the equipment room, and walked upstairs through a building that was largely empty. On the 14th floor, through the tall windows of the Halcroft Foundation room, the celebration was still going. He caught the reflected light of chandeliers from the stairwell landing, a warm amber spill against the February dark outside. He didn't stop to look. The invitation had gone out the previous Thursday to every department head, director, and team lead in the network, and by extension to the communications staff. The senior nursing coordinators, the financial analysts who'd modeled the grant projections. Roger Stemple, the director of operations, had built the list personally, organized by seniority tier, which was how Daniel's name had been considered and then set aside. Roger's notation on the draft was brief: biomedical tech, operational, not strategic, does not represent network at funding level. What the notation didn't mention was that a substantial share of the technical compliance documentation used to secure the grant, the equipment inventory assessments, the maintenance protocol certifications, the safety threshold records. Health Canada had reviewed for accreditation had been produced by Daniel over the preceding 18 months and submitted under the department header rather than his own name. Frank Ibarra, who supervised facilities support, and had worked beside Daniel long enough to know what his absence from any list meant, found him in the parking garage that night pulling on his jacket. He told him about the invitation. Daniel went still for a moment, the way he did when deciding how much to say, then told Frank it wasn't worth discussing, and that the MRI in sub-basement B was running clean now if, in shift, needed to know. Petra Farrow, 17, and finishing her first year of pre-health science at MacEwan, called her father as he drove home. She'd seen the network's social media post. The foundation room full of people, Catherine Lorne at the center, holding a framed copy of the federal approval letter, everyone's face bright with the relief of people who'd just gotten confirmation that the thing they wanted was going to happen. Petra had studied the photograph before calling. She told her father, in the direct way she'd inherited from him and from the mother she could barely remember, that an organization which spent 19 years putting his name on maintenance logs and never on an invitation list had no claim on how he spent his Thursday evening. Daniel thanked her and said she was probably right, then asked if she'd eaten. She had. They talked for 20 more minutes about something else entirely. The message from Meditech Precision had been sitting in his inbox for 60 hours. The Swiss medical equipment firm ran a technical exchange program, 45-day residency at their Calibration and Systems Integration Center in Basel, and the coordinator had written to Daniel directly, having learned from 2 prior attempts that routing anything through Halcroft's management layer was functionally equivalent to sending nothing. Daniel had applied 8 months earlier, attaching a technical summary, explaining that Meditech's methodology addressed precisely the long-cycle drift behavior he'd been documenting in Halcroft's imaging suite since the previous winter. Roger had reviewed the application and declined it with a single line. The program needed a representative who could engage at a policy and procurement level, and the slot was better suited to someone from clinical operations. The new message told Daniel the slot was still open. His name had come up during a technical review of documentation Halcroft had shared during the grant compliance process, and that the coordinator needed an answer before 8 the next morning. He read it twice, drove home, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote 4 documents. A formal unpaid leave request to Human Resources, 45 days starting the following Monday, a 14-page handover memo for Sandra Yee and Frank Ibarra, a list of 9 specific equipment risks to monitor in his absence, with threshold values that should trigger escalation to the manufacturer rather than to internal management, and a short note to Petra saying he was going to Switzerland and that she should call whenever she needed to. He submitted the leave request at 5:30 in the morning, then came in before his shift to walk Sandra through the handover in person. 3 hours on the risk list alone, and gave Frank the keys to the technical records cabinet. He told them both plainly, if any imaging unit crossed the listed thresholds, contact Meditech's technical support line directly. He'd already written down the name. Roger approved the leave within 35 minutes, reading Daniel's departure as a kind of professional sulk over the party. The sort of thing that would resolve itself once the man realized his absence went unremarked. Catherine Lorne received only a brief notice that a senior biomedical technician had begun unpaid leave for professional development. She didn't ask Roger for details. She was juggling calls with the Federal Health Ministry about implementation timelines, and 3 board members waiting on a capacity projection. Before the plane reached cruising altitude over the Rockies, Frank texted Daniel that Roger had extended the daily scan booking window by 90 minutes per unit, effective immediately, to show the board the network could absorb the volume the grant would eventually support. He'd also suspended 2 of the 3 scheduled preventive maintenance windows Daniel had built into a quarterly plan on the grounds that taking equipment offline during the network's highest profile week sent the wrong message to referring physicians. For the first 8 days, nothing appeared to go wrong. Sandra worked through the handover documentation with the care of someone who understood the systems well enough to keep them running, but was honest enough to know that understanding and fluency weren't the same thing. She caught 2 minor calibration alerts that week, cross-referenced them against Daniel's notes, and resolved both without escalating. An experience she later called the most unsettling confidence she'd ever felt in that job. The sensation of managing something she didn't fully own yet, and having nothing fail as a result. On day 6, Roger told Catherine the imaging suite was running above capacity targets for the first time in 3 years. True, and that this proved the department wasn't structurally dependent on any single technician. True only in the narrow sense that the machines were still running. He didn't mention that the increase came directly from the extended hours, that 2 maintenance windows had been canceled, or that the quality sampling intervals Daniel had built into the daily schedule had quietly dropped from 4 per shift to 1. In Basel, Daniel stood in front of the most precisely instrumented calibration environment he'd encountered in his career. Dr. Ingrid Haas, who'd run the exchange program for 26 years, demonstrated a field mapping technique that immediately explained a drift pattern he'd been observing in Halcroft's 1.5 Tesla unit for 11 months, without fully accounting for it. It was the specific satisfaction of a question that had taken years to sharpen, finally getting an answer. Ingrid watched him with the recognition of someone who knew the type, not defined by credentials, but by having spent so long with one set of systems that the systems became a language, and who translated new information into it at the speed of a native speaker. On day 9, a radiologist at a referring clinic in Ladakh queried Halcroft's quality team about 3 abdominal MRI reports from the previous week. A subtle softening in the deep pelvic region, at the same anatomical depth in all 3 images, more consistent than patient movement would explain. The quality team forwarded it to Roger, who filed it under pending review and didn't pass it up. Sandra found the anomaly on day 11. It started as a minor gain drift in the primary gradient amplifier of the main 3 Tesla unit, normally corrected in under 2 hours. But 8 pages into Daniel's handover notes, she found a section describing exactly what she was seeing. A compound drift pattern that emerged under high-duty cycle conditions once daily scan volume crossed a threshold. The unit wasn't rated to sustain continuously. The extended booking hours had pushed it past that threshold on 6 of the preceding 9 days. The note included a correction sequence, the safe operation thresholds, and a highlighted line. The issue could not be resolved permanently without a duty cycle review and full recalibration of the gradient amplifier chain, the same review Daniel had requested 3 times before he left. Sandra brought this to Roger and asked to cut daily scan volume by 15% and schedule the full calibration. Roger told her that would drop the network below the utilization metrics already given to the board, and asked her instead to adjust the quality sampling parameters so the drift value stayed under the automatic flag threshold. Frank, listening from the corridor, walked in and said plainly that tuning the sampling to hide a real drift wasn't a technical solution. Roger told him he was welcome to raise that with HR if he found the approach objectionable. Sandra sent Catherine's assistant a written summary that afternoon marked urgent. The routing system dropped it into the facilities queue behind 11 other tickets marked non-critical. In Basel, Ingrid set a printed copy of Halcroft's grant compliance documentation beside Daniel and asked if the methodology looked familiar. Every page listed the Biomedical Systems Department as author. Daniel confirmed it was his work. Ingrid then showed him a second document, a technical advisory Meditech had issued 7 months earlier to every facility running 3 Tesla units in high-volume configurations, recommending exactly the duty cycle cap and recalibration sequence Daniel had been requesting. It had gone to every registered technical contact on file. At the bottom of the acknowledgement log, one name appeared in the received column: R. Stempel, Director of Operations, Halcroft Regional Health Network. The formal notice from Health Canada arrived the following Wednesday. A provincial health quality inspector, following up on an escalated complaint from a physician whose patient had gotten a second MRI at a private center after Halcroft's results came back flagged as inconsistent, had opened a targeted equipment review. 2 of Halcroft's MRI units would face an unannounced technical inspection within 10 business days. Roger spent the next morning drafting an internal summary describing the situation as isolated calibration variance from a staffing transition during a high-growth period, and sent it to Catherine with a note suggesting it illustrated the risk of letting a senior technical specialist take extended leave without adequate knowledge transfer, quietly relocating the cause from his own decisions to Daniel's departure. Catherine called Daniel's mobile 4 times that afternoon. He was mid-demonstration at the Meditech facility with Ingrid and 2 engineers who'd driven from Lausanne for the session. That evening he replied by email. The warning for exactly this failure was in the handover notes, under gradient amplifier duty cycles, with thresholds set precisely to prevent it. Sandra and Frank had the standing to halt the suite and run the full calibration, and the network should call Meditech's technical support line directly. The contact was already in the handover package. Catherine read it twice and felt the discomfort of being shown something she'd already had the means to see and hadn't looked at. The next morning, Roger told the operations team that Daniel's reply amounted to withdrawing from his obligations and using the network's difficulty as leverage, and suggested that if he didn't return voluntarily, the network should consider a leave of absence review. At the midweek technical review in Basel, a name placard sat on the conference table. Daniel Farrow, Senior Systems Integration Specialist, Halcroft Regional Health Network. Daniel picked it up and told the coordinator the title was wrong. He was a biomedical equipment technician, grade 4. The coordinator, genuinely uncertain, said they'd drawn it from the documentation. Ingrid, standing nearby, said quietly that documentation bearing Halcroft's department header had already been cited in 2 formal submissions by European imaging centers adopting similar approaches, and that the gradient amplifier methodology in particular was being referenced as a real contribution to duty cycle management in high-volume 3 Tesla environments. She pulled out a portfolio of reports Halcroft had submitted to Meditech over 2 years of service reviews, every one authored by the Biomedical Systems Department. She'd assumed it was a working group. Daniel explained what it actually was. A header Roger applied to any document he wanted treated as an institutional product rather than a person's work, with the recognition and bonuses flowing to the operations director's office. The offer came 3 days later. A senior systems specialist position in Meditech's North American Partnership Program, authority to build a calibration methodology team, a salary well above his current one, and a transition that would let him stay in Edmonton until Petra finished her degree. Daniel read it, set it down, and walked a long way along the Rhine. When he came back, he told Ingrid he needed time, that what he actually wanted, and whether the decision was sound, had become entangled with a third question, whether he was angry, in a way that made them hard to separate. Ingrid asked him one thing, whether the organization he was considering staying loyal to had treated his work with the same care he'd given it. Daniel said he appreciated the question, but loyalty to the institution wasn't quite what was holding him back from signing. It was Sandra and Frank, and the technicians pulling double coverage since his leave began, none of whom had chosen any part of what was now happening to them. Catherine was preparing board materials for the Health Canada response when her assistant set a folder on her desk and suggested she look at it before the presentation was finalized. Inside was the original Gala invitation list, with a note that Frank had submitted Daniel's name for inclusion 3 separate times through the event system. On the final approved page, Daniel's name was struck through in red ink, with Roger's handwriting in the margin. Biomedical tech, operational, not strategic, does not represent network at funding level. She sat with it a long time before pulling other records, performance logs, project files, the internal bonus distributions from the previous 3 years. What she found was a pattern hard to look at once she saw its shape. 3 separate equipment crises over 4 years, each resolved through technical work, attributed to the Biomedical Systems Department. A label she now understood, Roger applied to channel credit away from the people who'd actually done it. She called Daniel from her personal phone that evening, told him she'd seen the list, and apologized. He said the party wasn't the wound. It had just made visible something he'd been too close to see. She asked what he meant. An organization that remembers your name only when equipment fails eventually makes the terms of the arrangement clear, he said. Not comfortable, but useful. She was still sitting with that when her phone lit up with a notice that the network's primary lender had flagged the account for a compliance call, prompted by the Health Canada inspection notice, now shared as part of standard regulatory disclosure. Catherine went to the imaging suite herself on day 31, still in the clothes she'd worn to a donor lunch, entirely wrong for the environment, and kept walking anyway. What she saw bore no resemblance to the weekly operations reports. The 3 Tesla unit in Suite 2 was offline. 17 appointments had been transferred to an external center at cost to the network. 2 technicians were working through 3 weeks of unreviewed calibration documentation, with no department lead to sign off on it. Sandra sat at a workstation with a printed signal map in one hand, and the look Catherine remembered from her own mirror during the network's worst accreditation cycle. Frank brought her into the meeting room off the equipment corridor and set down a binder. Every maintenance request, calibration log, escalation email, and internal ticket Daniel had filed over 10 months on duty cycle management and gradient amplifier integrity. Not the versions that had reached the board in operations updates. The originals, considerably more detailed, considerably more urgent, and stripped of that urgency before they'd gone up the chain. Sandra walked Catherine through the technical sequence using the handover notes. The compound drift Daniel had identified and managed manually for 8 months wasn't a secret. It was a documented, repeatedly escalated problem that Roger had either failed to forward or forwarded with the urgency removed. Catherine asked Roger in the meeting that followed why the equipment reports she'd received had described the variance as within acceptable parameters when the actual data said otherwise. He said the technical staff had inflated routine drift into a systemic issue to provide cover for Daniel's absence. The network CFO, Miriam Chow, pulled up the Health Canada preparation costs and noted the projected expense of the imaging transfers, the independent audit, and a potential federal penalty was tracking around $31 million above the network's contingency reserve. And that if the inspection resulted in an operating restriction, the network would breach the utilization covenant on its primary infrastructure loan. That evening, Catherine opened her email archive and found the last formal report Daniel had filed before his leave. On the first page, under Risk Summary, a sentence she hadn't registered before. If duty cycle limits are not restored and the gradient amplifier recalibration is not completed, measurable field inhomogeneity will appear in long scan acquisition sequences within 25 to 40 days of this report. She called him the next morning and asked him to come back. He said he'd return on one condition, not salary, not title. Had the network cut scan volume to the rated threshold, contacted Meditech for support, suspended all long scan acquisitions pending calibration, and disclosed the equipment status fully and honestly to Health Canada. Catherine said the board hadn't yet authorized full disclosure. The current plan was to manage the inspection through internal process while continuing limited operations. Then he couldn't be useful to her, Daniel said. What she was describing was him returning to apply a temporary fix, buy the network, and have this same conversation again. He'd spent the better part of a decade learning that temporary corrections on structural problems weren't solutions. They were postponements that made the eventual failure more expensive. Catherine said she understood, but people's livelihoods were at stake. He said he knew. They'd been at stakes since the moment Roger extended the booking hours on day 1 without reading the maintenance documentation. And the person who'd created that risk was the one who should answer for it, not the one who'd written the warning and been told it wasn't welcome. Ingrid had offered to send a Meditech technical team to Halcroft at no charge, contingent on an independent equipment audit. Catherine accepted before calling Daniel. The board chair, Gareth Whitmore, vetoed it in an emergency session, arguing that inviting an external audit would signal to the provincial ministry that Halcroft couldn't certify its own equipment, precisely the impression he needed to avoid. Since the regional hospital consolidation talks he was conducting in parallel depended on Halcroft being presented as an operationally stable anchor site, a picture the accurate data would badly complicate. Daniel sent one follow-up message: "Tell Health Canada the truth first, then call me." Over the next 2 days, in board meetings, legal consultations, and calls with the federal inspection team, Catherine did 4 things Gareth had explicitly told her not to do. She sent Health Canada a complete, unredacted account of the equipment situation, including the operational decisions that had led to continued use outside certified parameters. She placed Roger on administrative leave pending formal review. She accepted Meditech's offer of independent assessment, with findings to go to the federal team in full. And she ordered all long-scan acquisitions suspended until the assessment was done. Gareth called an emergency session and told the board Catherine had unilaterally compromised the network's regulatory standing, disclosed confidential information without authorization, removed a senior director without due process, and given an external party access to proprietary equipment data, and moved to suspend her as CEO pending governance review. Miriam told the board that the alternative Gareth was proposing, continuing operations under the current equipment status while managing Health Canada through selective disclosure, carried a liability profile no directors and officers policy she'd reviewed would cover, and that it wasn't a strategy, just a postponement of a larger collapse. The board didn't vote that night. They agreed to reconvene in 48 hours. In the meantime, Health Canada confirmed that without a credible remediation plan within 5 days, the imaging suite would face a temporary operating restriction. The window closed on the same day Daniel's program in Basel ended. He landed in Edmonton on a gray Tuesday morning and took the train instead of driving, because he needed to think before deciding anything, then walked to the hospital from the LRT stop to see the building from outside before he saw it from within. The main entrance looked ordinary. It was the delivery bay that told him something was wrong. Half the regular supply vehicles missing, which shouldn't have been possible at a facility running full clinical operations. The banner announcing the federal grant had been swapped for a seasonal message, the mounting brackets still showing the pale outline of where the larger display had hung. He was reading messages at the staff entrance when Catherine came through the door, dressed like someone who'd been in the building since before the morning shift, because she had been. She handed him a folder without a word. Inside were 5 documents: the full disclosure letter to Health Canada, the administrative leave notice for Roger, the request for independent assessment to Meditech, the board-approved authorization suspending long-scan operations, and a signed commitment restructuring the biomedical services department so technical, leads could suspend equipment operation on safety grounds without operational director approval. She'd done what he asked, she said before calling him. He looked through each page and told her he could see that. Ingrid and 3 Meditech engineers arrived 2 hours later. Daniel walked in with them not as a returning employee, but as a technical advisor to the independent team, a distinction that mattered because it meant his assessment couldn't be reworked by any internal reporting structure before it reached the board. He asked first for the calibration logs from the preceding 42 days, then for the baseline reference data he'd been maintaining manually before he left. Frank said, carefully, that there was something they needed to see first. The calibration baseline database, the reference values Daniel had built through manual measurement and logging over 2 years, was gone. Not archived, not corrupted. The server logs showed a deliberate deletion sequence run from Roger's administrative account 8 days after Daniel left for Switzerland at 2:23 in the morning, followed by an overwrite of the backup partition. Roger, contacted by the board's outside counsel, denied any memory of it and suggested Daniel might have removed the data himself to ensure his continued relevance. The access logs disproved that within 15 minutes, the last entry under Daniel's credentials was a routine end-of-shift log at 11:51 the night before his flight. The Meditech team spent 2 hours trying to reconstruct the reference curve from indirect sources before Sandra, working in silence at the next workstation, stopped and said she needed to check the equipment storage room. 14 months earlier, before a firmware update, Daniel had connected a standalone diagnostic tablet to the 3 Tesla unit to capture a full baseline field map, telling Sandra at the time that the network's server backups had failed across 3 prior update cycles, and the tablet would serve as insurance. The update went fine. The tablet got set aside and never made it back into inventory. They found it in a storage crate under a shelf of legacy mounting hardware, 51% battery. The data was intact. Daniel didn't treat it as vindication. He handed the tablet to Sandra, asked her to verify the data and begin the reconstruction, then divided the work into tracks on the facility floor plan: reference curve to Sandra, shift coordination to Frank, hardware to the Meditech engineers, integration to himself, and sent Catherine word that the baseline had been recovered, and there was a realistic path to restoring the suite. Restoring operation wasn't the same as certifying it, though. Certification meant reviewing every scan produced during the high-duty cycle period and flagging any whose quality couldn't be independently verified. Gareth called a board meeting for 10 that night with a prepared resolution: suspend Catherine, reinstate Roger on an interim basis, resume limited imaging operations under the previous protocol, and pursue dispute resolution with Health Canada instead of voluntary certification. He read each provision with the fluency of 30 years. Spent making decisions that served his own interests, sound like decisions that served the institution. Catherine laid the documents on the table in order, from Daniel's first duty cycle warning 10 months earlier to the server log, showing the deletion timestamp and the account name, and explained what the network had known, when, who had suppressed it, and what that had cost. Miriam laid out the financial exposure just as plainly. A formal Health Canada compliance action could run $40 to $60 million against an insurance ceiling of $22 million, with the gap coming from operating reserve, and Gareth's approach would only widen it. Daniel spoke briefly, saying Catherine had made decisions he wouldn't have expected from her 2 months earlier, and that being transparent with Health Canada before being forced to had cost on the network real money and real standing, and had also been the only path to a recoverable outcome. Sandra spoke after him, telling the board something none of the documents captured. The network's dependence on Daniel's manual interventions hadn't come from him trying to make himself irreplaceable. It came from every proposal he'd made for a proper calibration system, documented protocols, trained backups, equipment authority that didn't route through operations, being deprioritized in favor of throughput targets. The real vulnerability wasn't the absence of one person. It was the absence of a structure that treated equipment integrity as a condition of operating rather than an obstacle to it. The board voted. Gareth was suspended from the chair pending review. Roger's leave was converted to termination pending investigation. Catherine kept the CEO position by 1 vote. Health Canada extended the remediation window by 2 days. The 4 days that followed were the most organized, most transparent, and most demanding Daniel had managed in 19 years. The difference this time being that everyone in the room knew what they were doing and why it mattered. He put a whiteboard at the entrance to the suite, split into 4 tracks: hardware assessment, reference curve reconstruction, integration testing, Health Canada documentation, each with a named lead and backup. Every update logged in real time so nothing lived only in one person's head. Sandra worked through the first night, and by morning had rebuilt the field reference curve, precisely enough for the Meditech engineers to set the recalibration parameters. When she presented her method at the morning briefing, Daniel stopped the meeting to say it was more rigorous than what he'd have used, and that the documentation should name her as its author. The recalibration took most of 2 days, validation most of the 3rd. By the morning of the 4th, Ingrid signed the independent certification, confirming both units were within specified parameters. The Health Canada team observed a live production sequence, and the run passed every measurement applied. By late afternoon, Health Canada confirmed it would not impose an operating restriction though the formal compliance review would continue as a process matter. With a corrective action plan and restructured equipment authority protocols due within 90 days. The financial cost, external imaging transfers, the independent audit, the Health Canada process, extra radiologist review hours for the flagged backlog, came to $19 million. Enough to hurt, not enough to breach the loan covenants. Catherine told the board the network had survived, and that survived was the right word, but the more important question was what it did with the survival. Because if the only outcome of the preceding 45 days was a better title and a salary correction for Daniel Farrow, the lesson hadn't been learned. 6 months passed. Roger's termination was finalized once the investigation confirmed he'd deleted the calibration baseline database, altered the sampling protocol without clinical authorization, redacted material warnings from board reports, and claimed credit for technical work he hadn't done. Gareth resigned from the board entirely when the investigation surfaced the parallel consolidation talks he'd run without authorization. Talks that included a personal advisory fee contingent on the network's asset valuation staying above a threshold the accurate liability data would have breached. The Biomedical Services Department was restructured so technical leads reported directly to the board on equipment integrity and held unilateral authority to suspend operation when safety thresholds were at risk, with no operational director approval required. A cross-training requirement mandated that every critical calibration procedure be known by at least 3 staff members and documented in a format that didn't need management sign-off. Daniel didn't return as a Halcroft employee. He incorporated an independent biomedical systems consultancy, contracted with Halcroft and with Meditech's North American Partnership Program, chose his own projects, built a team of 4 specialists over the following year, and put his name on every report they produced. Catherine organized a gathering at the hospital itself, not a gala, just the main floor common area, long tables from the conference rooms, food from 4 restaurants the staff had voted on. The invitation list ran from the housekeeping team and overnight security to the newly restructured board, everyone else alphabetical in between, so a dietary aid's name landed before a department director's and a porter's before a physician's, and no one remarked on it because that was simply how the list read now. Daniel's name sat near the top of the F section, prepared by Frank Ibarra himself, with no red annotations. Daniel arrived in his work clothes, nodded to the people he recognized, and took a seat near the equipment bay entrance. When Catherine stood to speak, she didn't mention the federal grant, the accreditation, or the network's standing in the provincial health landscape. She said the network had spent the better part of a year learning that an imaging suite doesn't run on funding announcements or utilization targets. It runs on the people who show up when the building is quiet and do the hard, specific work of keeping things from going wrong. The network had been fortunate to have such people, she said, and hadn't always deserved that fortune. She thanked Frank, Sandra, Miriam, the Meditech team, and the staff who'd absorbed the disruption without complaint. She thanked Daniel last, and didn't call him irreplaceable or the man who'd saved the network, because he'd asked her not to, and because she understood by then why that framing was its own problem. It turned a structural failure into a personnel story, and the network couldn't afford to make that mistake twice. Afterward, Catherine handed him an envelope. A formal invitation to represent both Halcroft and Meditech's North American program at an international biomedical systems conference in Basel the following spring. He read it and asked whether anyone had checked for a candidate with more operational seniority and a more appropriate stakeholder profile. There might be, she said, but no one had earned the seat more clearly. He'd go on one condition, he said. Sandra Yee would co-present, and her name would come first on the materials. Catherine agreed before he finished the sentence. They walked out into the cold November air together, and she told him she was sorry it had taken a near disaster to make her look at what had been in front of her for a long time. He said the party wasn't the wound. The wound was closer to 2 decades of an organization that only remembered his name when something stopped working. But the party had been clarifying the way a thing you've avoided looking at directly becomes clear once you finally turn toward it. She asked, carefully, whether there was anything outside the work they'd be permitted to find out about. He told her he didn't make promises about things he couldn't yet verify, but he was willing to find out. They could start with coffee the next morning. Somewhere near the hospital where neither of them would be expected to give a presentation or sit across a table from the other. Before getting into his car, he stood a moment and looked back at the building he'd walked into for 19 years. The same building that had left his name off a list and then run itself into a federal compliance crisis. The moment he stopped standing in the dark to hold it together. What he felt wasn't the satisfaction of having been proven right. It was quieter than that, and more useful. The relief of a man who had finally stopped measuring the worth of his work by whether the people who benefited from it remembered to put his name on the invitation, and who had come back not to keep carrying the building alone, but to help it become something that would no longer need one person working in sub-basement B at midnight to keep it from falling.